Hello again, it's Joe Callihan, and as you may recall, last week's subject was the story of my grandfather, John Edward Garrison. I spoke of many of the interesting things that happened in his life. This week I would like to tell you about my grandmother's life story, also fascinating. These are from my book called Golden Memories of my grandparents, Ruth and Sam, my grandparents. Now, although I called both of my grandparents by their first name, I did so with the utmost respect, and they didn't seem to mind it because they knew the respect was there. To begin with, my grandmother, Ruth Lee Adams, was born in Wytheville, Virginia in 1895. Her father, who was a bridge builder, died when inspecting under a bridge. It collapsed on him. She was only 6 years old at the time. Her widowed mother, as they had no such thing as Social Security back then, was having a very difficult time raising Ruth and her younger sister, May. And one day when Ruth returned home from school, she was 13 at the time, she discovered that she had been abandoned by her mother, who had taken 8-year-old May with her and moved to an unknown city. Going into the bedroom, she found on the bed a note left to her by her mother, explaining her decision. In it, she told Ruth of how May, being younger and so very dainty, would not have as good a chance of surviving on her own as would Ruth, who was a tomboy, quick-thinking, and resilient. Well, she went outside and started walking around the house, walking around in circles, and she was praying and asking God, what should I do? What can I do? I've been abandoned. Where do I go from here? Well, the next door neighbor, a lady by the name of Emma, who ran a boarding house, observed Ruth walking around in circles around the house. Now, Emma had known that Ruth's mother had left town. So she called out to Ruth and said, Ruth, why are you still here? Don't you know your mother and your sister left? Her answer was in pride, yes, I know that. I just came back to look at the old house one more time. Well, as it was getting near dark, Emma invited Ruth to stay overnight. And as she did, both Emma and her two boarders, who were named Bill and Fletch, heard her crying all night long. And they immediately sensed what had happened, that Ruth had been abandoned. So in the morning, May, at breakfast time, came up to Ruth and said, I've had a brilliant idea. Why don't you stay and live with us? Uncle Bill and Uncle Fletch said, that's a great idea. We love your personality, your sense of humor. It's so much delight to have you around. Would you please stay and live here with Emma and us? My grandmother was overwhelmed, and she was so delighted. She naturally accepted. Those are some people I'd love to meet when I get to heaven, this Aunt Emma and Uncles Bill and Fletch. I want to thank them for what they did for my grandmother. Well, in effect, they more or less adopted Ruth, although not officially. And they paid for her schooling, and of course her food, and Ruth grew to be a very intelligent child. Now, in Wytheville, they had a old Methodist church that had been built during the Civil War. It was made of wood, and it was crumbling. The roof leaked, the wood was rotting, they needed a new church building. Well, as it turned out, Ruth inquired and found that the church committee had gone to this was a railroad city, and in these railroad cities of that date, the railroad would come in and build housing for the people that worked for them. And they would more or less construct a small town, including the church. So Ruth discovered that the church committee had gone to the local superintendent of the railroad and requested building supplies that they might be able to build a new church, and he flatly turned them down. Upon hearing this, Ruth decided, why bother with the middleman? Go right to the top. So as a young girl, still in her teens, I think she was about 14 at the time, she took it on herself to travel alone 100 miles to go to see the city that housed the district manager for the state of that particular railroad, a Mr. Johnson. Showing up outside his office, she spoke to his secretary and she said, I would like to speak to Mr. Johnson. The secretary naturally asked, do you have an appointment? Ruth said, no, but he'll see me. And the secretary said, well, young lady, he doesn't see anyone without an appointment. And Ruth replied, tell him it's about the souls of the people working for him. Well, she said, I'll tell him that. She went in and she told Mr. Johnson, there's a young lady out here who wants to speak with you about concerning the souls of the people who work for you. Well, Mr. Johnson was intrigued by that, so he said, well, bring her on in. Ruth went in to see Mr. Johnson, and she said immediately she was impressed. Not only was he a large man compared to her, but the furnishings in his office were just extravagant. She knew she was talking to someone with a position of power and authority. So she told Mr. Johnson about the situation that they were having in Woodville and how the church was falling apart. The people had actually requested supplies to build a new church, and they would furnish the labor. He said, well, you need to ask Mr. what's his name, isn't he the manager in that area? And she said, that was useless. He's already been asked, and he flatly turned the people down. Ruth said, I thought, why not go to the top? You're the man who has the power to say yes or no. You're the man who could make it happen. So I'm here to ask you, would you please supply the materials that we need to build our new church? In the meantime, I forgot to tell you that both uncles Bill and Fletch owned a construction company. And in Woodville, they had built many of the houses for that railroad for the employees. So Mr. Johnson was familiar with them. And Ruth, before she made this trip, had asked Uncle Bill and Uncle Fletch if they would make her a list of all the things that would be needed in order to build a new church, right down to the last nail. And they complied. They gave her such a list. So then Ruth pulled out her trump card. She said, Mr. Johnson, my uncles, Bill and Fletch, have promised that if you'll supply the materials needed, then they would build the church for free. Mr. Johnson laughed and he said, skinflints like Bill and Fletch do something for free? He said, that's hard to believe. Ruth then pulled out the list and she said, here's the list that Uncle Bill and Uncle Fletch made of the supplies that they'll be needing. Now, Fletch was known as the local atheist. He said, ain't no way I'm ever going to become one of those Christians. That was his attitude. So Mr. Johnson looked over the list and he said, well, I see it's in their handwriting. They actually made this list? Ruth said, yes, and I'm presenting it to you, asking if you'll supply the materials that they need. And he said, well, this I've got to see. He said, if you can get Bill and Fletch to build that church for free, then gladly I'll supply the materials needed. Ruth said, when can they expect them in? So she got a date for delivery on the supplies. Well, she took that long 100-mile train ride back to Withville, and that evening, as they were having dinner, Ruth decided to confront Bill and Fletch with her situation. She was so wise. So Ruth told them, Uncle Bill and Uncle Fletch, if I can get Mr. Johnson to supply you those supplies that you need to build our church, would you be willing to build it for free? Well, both of them, knowing Mr. Johnson, laughed. And they said, that old skinflint Johnson, he wouldn't donate a nail. And she said, but what if I could get him to do that? Would you build it for free? And they just laughed and they said, well, if you can get that old boy to donate what we need, then yes, I guess we would agree to build it for free for you. Then Ruth told them, Mr. Johnson has approved the supplies and they'll be here by such and such date. They almost fell off their chair. Well, they'd committed to build this church for free. She set them up, played a con on them. So anyway, they got that church built. By the way, before she left, Mr. Johnson said, Ruth, tell your pastor that he needed not to come to me. He couldn't have found a better spokesperson than you. But anyway, they got the church built, and something really wonderful happened. As a result, when the church opened, one of the people attending was Uncle Fletch. And before that service was over, he went to the altar and gave his life to Jesus Christ. Now then, there's the story. Now these are all contained in my book. You'd love to get a copy of it. These aren't even all the things. My grandmother lived to be 93 and she had a lot of adventures in that time. But this is a story about little Joe learning how to play a card game. And it's kind of funny. A little risque, but it's really kind of funny. I think I was about 5 years old at the time, and Ruth would have neighborhood ladies come in and they'd spread the local gossip, and they'd spend time having coffee and cake and playing cards. Well, one day I was sitting in watching them playing this card game, and I kept observing and seemed to have an interest in it. So one of the ladies said, Joe, would you like to learn how to play this game? And I said, yes, I would. So she volunteered to teach me how to play the game. And of course they rigged the deck in my favor. You know, once I'd caught on the idea of how it was played, they rigged the deck and then they dealt to me, and in their dealings I had all four of the aces, the highest cards you could have, and there were no more left. So as they got around to making their bids, for some reason or another, I was only 5, and I kept mistaking the word aces for a different word that sounded similar, but it was definitely different. So when it got to be my turn to ask for the bids, I said to them, okay, ladies, put your asses on the table. And they looked in shock, like, what did he just say? I meant aces, but I said, put your asses on the table. And they're just like looking at one another like, did he really, this little 5-year-old kid told us to put our asses on the table? And they looked over to my grandmother for an explanation, and it didn't do them any good. She'd fallen off her chair, and she was bent over on the floor laughing her head off. She couldn't even talk to him. She was laughing so hard. And then one of the ladies said, he's definitely a chip off his father. So that was kind of a little funny event that happened. Of course, I outgrew that, thank goodness. Anyway, Ruth taught me how to be charitable and have a giving heart. And in one of my favorite stories, which there are many, but she gathered together items that were needed for a family of a suicidal man. As it turned out, this man lived in Ironton, Ohio, across the Ohio River from Russell, where I was growing up. And it made the news that he had tried to commit suicide by turning on the gas and putting his head inside the oven. His wife came home just in time to keep him from dying. the reasoning for it was he was a coal miner who had gotten injured in a slide, and it had injured his back and almost paralyzed him to where he could not work. And again, the mine had no protection for the workers, and there was no Social Security. So his wife was having to work 2 jobs, and they had, I think, about 5 children to support. And they were having an extremely difficult time getting by. Well, when Ruth heard of all this, she decided something needs to be done here. So she visited with them, and she saw their house. They'd sold just about everything they had of value. The furniture they had was rickety and falling apart. They had no television set or nothing for entertainment. And here this man was sitting around almost paralyzed all day long with nothing to do. So Ruth said, well, we've got to do something about that. So she went to this large department store in Ashland that was called Parsons Department Store. And then she went in to see Mr. Parsons, the owner, personally, to get his aid in helping this family. Now, before she went in to see him, she'd gone into the television department and she asked the salesman to show her their very best television set. He showed her a 25-inch black and white. Said, this is the latest, the greatest. So then she went in to see Mr. Parsons, who took her in, of course, without any, having asked in advance. And she said, Mr. Parsons, there's a family in Ohio where the man tried to commit suicide, and he needs your help. And she explained to him about the situation that that family faced. So she said, I'd like for you to have delivered to their house, and here's their address, the such and such model 25-inch black and white television set. And he said, oh, that's an excellent choice, Mrs. Garrison. That's one of our very best. And she said, I know, I asked the salesman to show me the best. And he said, well, it's very reasonable, too. It'll only cost you $400. And she said, oh, no, Mr. Parsons, you don't understand. I want you to give that television set to the family. That man is in need of entertainment to distract him from his problems. He said, well, Mrs. Garrison, you realize that I'm running a business here, and if I were to just start giving things away, I wouldn't be in business for long. So she then asked, well, Mr. Parsons, let me ask you this. How much money have I spent in this past year at your store? And he said, well, just a moment, I'll get accounting and we'll look it up for you. And she said, no need to do that. Before I came to see you, I did. And I've spent over $7,000, which in the 1950s, early 1950s, that was mucho money. Well, she hit him where he lived. And she said, I'm sure you would like for me to spend at least that much or maybe more this year. She said, do you get my point? He said, I believe I do. Well, what's the address? We'll have them send the TV set over to her, to the family. So then, the next thing you know, she got a phone call from Mr. Parsons about a day later. He said, Mrs. Garrison, I just thought you might like to know that the men who delivered that TV set to the family in Arden told me about the dilapidated condition of their furniture. And I've decided to donate an entire living room and bedroom set of furniture to them as well. Then she said, this is a large family, they need food. So she went to Russell. We had 2 major grocery stores. And there was a Mr. Woolery, who's related to Chuck Woolery from the dating game. Anyway, she went to Mr. Woolery's store first, and she told him the situation. And then she said, Mr. Woolery, I want 5 of your best hams. I want so much of your roast beef. I want so many pounds of your ground beef. And and I forgot she'd also had Mr. Parsons donate a freezer. So anyway, he said, well, Mrs. Garrison, don't go overboard here. He said, I'm a humble businessman, and I don't really have a lot of money, and I can't be giving away my entire grocery store. And she said, Mr. Woolery, what I'm asking you to do is to store up treasure in heaven. This family is in desperate need of help, and you're the man to see. So he said, well, I'll tell you what. He said, I'll donate 5 bags of groceries. How's that? She said, that sounds good. Then she left him and she went to his rival, Mr. Parks, who had a grocery store. She went in to see him. She said, Mr. Parks, I was just over to see Mr. Woolery, and she explained about the family in Ohio, and she said, they really need food. They have a large family. And Mr. Woolery donated 8 bags of groceries. She said, how about you? What are you willing to donate? And he said, well, if Woolery donated 8, I'll make it 10. She said, that's very nice. And then she went back to Mr. Woolery and she said, I just returned from Mr. Parks, and he donated 15 bags of groceries. And he said, Parks did what? She said, he donated 15 bags of groceries. Are you going to let him get away with that? Mr. Woolery said, I don't know if I believe that, Mrs. Garrison. He said, I know Parks too well. I can't imagine him donating 15 bags of groceries. She said, feel free to call him if you'd like. And he said, I'll do just that if you don't mind. So he picks up the phone and he calls the grocery store, gets Parks on the line, and he said, Mrs. Garrison's here with me, and she tells me that you donated 15 bags of groceries to that family. Well, now Parks knew that he had done no such thing, but he also knew Mr. Woolery was his competition, so he said, yes, that's right. So Mr. Woolery looked at Ruth and he said, well, damn, I'm not going to let that Parks outdo me. I'll make it 20 bags of groceries. And Ruth said, that's a good idea. And then she went back. And, Parks, when he talked to Mr. Woolery, she didn't go back, but Parks, when he talked to Mr. Woolery, he said, please tell Mrs. Garrison that's the best I can do. And so, in effect, she wound up, he did give the 15 bags of groceries along with Mr. Woolery's 20. That was 35 bags of groceries. They needed every inch of that freezer to handle it all. But she was so clever in the way she did things like that. She also taught me to be generous. It wasn't too long after I'd had my birthday, and for my birthday I was given a brand new bicycle, which was a deluxe model. It had a radio on it, which was the first, a new thing in those days. It had powerful headlight, tail light that ran by a generator that connected to the spokes, and a loud horn, and a lot of chrome. Was real classy. Well, it turns out Ruth had that family from Ohio come over and visit her at her home because she had some more things to give them. And the oldest son, who was the same age I was, all of a sudden we were outside and I saw him riding my bicycle up and down the street. And he stopped where I was and he said, look at my new bicycle, isn't it something? And I'm going like, what? Well, I immediately went running inside and I came up to my grandmother and I said, hey, what's the idea of giving my bicycle to this kid? And my grandmother said, Joe, he needs it far more than you do. And I said, yeah, but you just gave it to me for my birthday. And she said, shut up. Your grandfather and I can always replace it with another. This boy needs it, and he needs it now. So I went outside, and his name was Joe also, and I said, hey, Joe, look at this. Did you know it has a radio on it? And I flipped the radio on and showed him how it worked. And I said, look at how bright the light is on it. And I'm just, and he said, oh, I didn't notice that, and I was taught to have a generous and giving heart towards those who were really needy, much more needy than I. Also, I think I may as well admit to you that Ruth was somewhat like the Auntie Mame character to me. My grandfather, having attained a very high position on the C&O Railroad as master mechanic, before he retired he was making $550 a week in 1950, and he had 5,000 people working under him. And so he was given a pass to travel in a sleeper room, on any railroad line in the United States, including Canada. So several times my grandmother took me on trips to Washington, D.C., and we had chauffeured escorts take us around to show us all the different sites. But on one very memorable trip, we'd gone out to California, and then from there we went to Canada. And we were traveling on this Canadian line, and we had a sleeper compartment in it. And in the back of the train, they used to have what they called the observation car. It was, I think they still have them today, but it was just loaded with windows. Windows on the roof, windows on the sides of the roof. You could look out and see the beauty surrounding you. It was during the winter time, and there was a lot of piles of snow on the ground. So I believe at the time I was only around 4 years old. I know I wasn't in school, but I was a little 4-year-old brat, and then with all the energy that brats have, I was running up and down the aisles terrorizing the passengers, yelling and screaming and bang bang shooting my imaginary gun in the air. All of a sudden the man who was sitting there reached out and grabbed me by the arm, and he said, "Whoa, partner, where are you going?" So he had me take him back and introduce him to my grandmother, who was a little further back in the coach. And she was very tired. We'd had a long trip. And so he was noticing that she was having a hard time staying awake. Now she said that he looked somewhat familiar to her, but she couldn't quite place where she'd seen him. But this man told her, "If you'd like, I'll let you catch some sleep, and I can have Joe come up and sit with me, and I'll entertain him while you're sleeping." He said, "I'm not due to get into my stop for another hour, so you can catch a good hour's sleep." My grandmother said he was very well dressed, and at those days you didn't have as many idiots, perverted idiots roaming around. So she let him do that, and so he was sitting by the window, he had me sitting on his lap, and he was showing me interesting things as we went by. There was a place where we came by that they were loading coal onto coal cars on a train on another track that was right next to ours. And he was telling me that they're loading that up to help feed people's furnaces during this winter so that they won't freeze to death. Then at another time we saw a reindeer off in the snow, and he made up this neat story about that's one of Santa's reindeers. Santa Claus lives out that way. And he made up a whole story about that. The thing that I remembered most about this man was his voice. He had such a rich, melodious, deep, masculine voice. You could listen to him all day and never get bored. You know, he was fascinating to listen to. Anyway, the next thing you know, we're coming into his stop. It was a ski resort, a very popular ski resort. So he brought me back to my grandmother as they were announcing that they were going to be pulling into the resort. And he told my grandmother, he said, "Now, at this resort, there's a lot of these movie people that come and go on a whim." And he said, "There are no sleeping compartments available, so what they do is they'll bribe the conductor to get you out of your compartment so they can have it." He said, "Don't allow them to do that to you and Joe." So that was a good warning. Now the way she found out who it was, she said when he got off of the train, she noticed that the red cap who was with him, he had his luggage, and she said it was the most exquisite luggage that she'd ever seen. So she asked the conductor, and she pointed to him, she said, who is that man? And the conductor looked at her in disbelief, and he said, "Don't you know who that is?" And she said, "No, I think I've seen him somewhere before, but I can't place it." He said, "That's Clark Gable. I mean, the king of the movies, the big man, the number one." My grandmother thought, "Oh my goodness." Well, sure enough, it didn't take long after, when the train pulled out away from that ski resort, that the conductor knocked on our sleeping compartment door, and he tells my grandmother, now I overheard all this, so I know what I'm talking about. He told my grandmother, "I'm sorry, there's been a terrible mistake made. Your pass doesn't allow you to have a sleeping compartment on this line. You and your grandson will have to come outside and go coach." My grandmother said, "That's a lie, and we're not moving." I heard the woman outside telling the conductor, she said, "Come on, get that woman out of that room. I'm sleepy. I gave you $100. Get her out of there now." And the conductor said to her, "Just be quiet, I'm trying." Well, my grandmother closed the door on him and she locked the door, and then she told me, she said, "I'm going back to the dining compartment and I want you to lock the door behind me and don't open it for anyone but me." So my grandmother went to the dining compartment and she asked them if they would bring her a pen, paper, and the address of the head of that particular railroad line. So they brought these items to her, and then they questioned her. They said, "Is there any problem that we could help you with?" My grandmother said, "There's a very big problem. It's that conductor who tried to get my grandson and I to leave our sleeping compartment." She said, "I'm reporting that." She said it wasn't any time at all until that conductor came back to her and he started crying tears. "Oh, please don't report me. I have a wife and 4 children to support. If I lose my job, I don't know what I'll do." And my grandmother said, "Well, you should have thought about them before you tried to kick my grandson and I out into coach." She said, "I see no reason why I shouldn't report you. What you did is wrong." He said, "Oh, I know it's wrong. I promise I'll never ever do it again. I promise, please just don't report me." Well, she said that for some dumb reason, she told him she wouldn't report it. She said later, once she got home, she regretted that because she knew his tears were crocodile tears, and as long as he could make $100, he'd do that again and again and again in the future. But the fun part is this, the ending to the story. We get home and my grandmother couldn't wait to tell my grandmother. Guess who we met on the train? My mother said, "Who?" She said, "Clark Gable." My mother said, "Oh, no!" And my grandmother said, "Yes," and Joe got to sit on his lap. My mother said, "Oh, I wish it had been me." And so that's how that went. Pretty good so far. It's an interesting book. That was quite an interesting life. Then I need to tell you about the time that Ruth protected me from Sister Evil. Not all these nuns are delightfully holy people. Some of them are frustrated lesbians who hate men. And I ran across one of them when I was going to school in Ironton, Ohio. And I don't even remember her actual name, but I called her, I have a favorite nickname for her, Sister Evil. It turned out, I think I was going into the 4th grade, and in the 4th grade, they taught you to learn cursory writing. You didn't print anymore like a little child. You would make cursory writing the way everyone does. Well, as I was attempting to do that, I was doing it with my left hand because that's the way I felt the most comfortable and that's the way I could do it the neatest. Well, Sister Evil came by and she caught me writing with my left hand. She said, "Oh no, honey, you must write with your right hand." I said, but Sister Evil, it turns out sloppy when I do that. She said, "You'll get over that. You must write with your right hand." So I tried, and it turned out to be just scribble. I couldn't even read one letter. But I'd look on either side of me, and I'd see the kids that were writing, and it was neat looking. And I thought, well, I can do that, but I have to do it with my left hand. So I'd revert back to using my left hand, put the pen in my left hand, and start writing as neat as the next guy. Sister Evil came by and again caught me writing with my left hand. So she decided to make an example of me to the rest of the class. She brought me up in front of the class and she had this wooden ruler. In those days they didn't have such a thing as a plastic ruler. so it was made out of wood. And then she had me hold my left hand out in front of her, and in front of the whole class. She started whacking my hand, not lightly, but just as hard as she could, over and over and over again, until that ruler actually broke in two. And you'd think it would be over. But when that happened, she looked down at the desk of the boy in front of me. She picked up his wooden ruler and continued slapping me over my knuckles, just as hard as she could. When I got home from school that evening, and I came in, my grandmother noticed the bruises on the knuckles on my left hand. Of course, she was concerned, and she said, "Joe, what happened to you? How did you get this way? Where did all these bruises come from?" I told her Sister Evil didn't like me writing with my left hand, and she decided to make an example out of me, and she just hit me over and over again with a wooden ruler. That did it for my grandmother. She said, "We need to go see Sister Evil." So when my poor grandfather got home from work, and he'd been up since 4 o'clock that morning, and he gets home from work, my grandmother didn't have dinner ready for him. She said, "Hop in the car. We're going over to Ironton, and we're going to visit Sister Evil." And he said, "Well, what's this all about?" She said, "Look at Joe's hand." And it was just bruises all over my knuckles. And she said, "That idiot beat Joe with a ruler, and she needs to find out that that just doesn't go over big with me." So my grandfather said, no, don't do anything drastic. And my grandmother said, "Just shut up and drive the car." And with her voice inflection and the way she looked, my grandfather knew the best thing he could do was shut up and drive that car over to Ironton. So we stopped outside the nunnery, where they had a whole gaggle of nuns staying. And my grandmother took me and went up to the front door, and then she rang the doorbell and pounded on the door. Well, as it turns out, a different nun came to the door and greeted my grandmother. And my grandmother said, "I want to speak with Sister Evil, and I want to speak to her now." The nun said, "Well, Mrs. Garrison, the nuns have just sat down to eating dinner." She said, "Could you possibly come back another day or another time?" And my grandmother said, "No." She said, "I want to speak to that woman, and I want to speak to her right now. Do you understand me?" The nun said, "I believe I do. I'll see if I can go get her." So the nun walked away, and a short while later, along comes Sister Evil. Not a very intelligent person. So the first thing my grandmother did, very calmly, she looked at Sister Evil. She grabbed my wrist and stuck my left hand in front of her face, and she said, "I have a question for you. Did you do this to Joseph?" Sister Evil replied, "Yes, ma'am, I did." My grandmother said, "May I ask you why?" And Sister Evil's response was, "Well, science has proved that everyone should be right-handed, and that left-handedness is a sign of retardation. And you don't want all of the children to be laughing at Joe because he uses his left hand instead of his right." My grandmother was thinking, "What an idiot!" So she looked at her and she said, "Sister Evil, let me make something very clear to you." She said, "Joseph was born left-handed. He enjoys being left-handed. And as far as you and I are concerned, he's going to stay left-handed. Do you understand that?" Sister Evil said, "Well, if you want all the kids to be laughing at him and making fun of him and calling him retarded." My grandmother was ready to blow a fuse. She said, "Sister Evil, let me see if I can clarify this for you a little bit better so that you will fully understand where I'm coming from." She said, "If ever anything even remotely close to this ever happens to Joe again, I'll be coming back to see you, only I won't be coming back to waste words on you. She said, I guarantee you I will have a lot of fun, but you most definitely will not. Now do you understand me? Sister Evil said, yes, ma'am, I believe I do. My grandmother said, good. Then from now on, you leave Joe alone, and if he wants to write left-handed, then left-handed he will be. And we left. Well, I was proud of my grandmother. She didn't knock her teeth out. I was afraid she was going to, because I knew my grandmother's temper. She grew up as a tomboy with her two brothers, and anyway, I was proud of her taking up for me like that. A lot of the Catholics are taught these people are so holy you can let them do anything and they can do no wrong, whether it's good, bad, or indifferent. Don't ever complain about it. Well, my grandmother wasn't that way. The funny part of it is that as the years went by, I developed into a pretty good left-hander. As a pitcher, I pitched left-handed, and they'd say, oh no, lefty's up. And right-handed batters have the worst time dealing with left-handed pitchers. But anyway, the fun part of it is I would have people ask me, are you strictly left-handed? And the answer I came up with was straightforward and direct. And I would tell them pretty much so. The only time I'm ambidextrous is when I'm on a date. Now, I know I've run for quite a while, but I have just a little more to tell you about, and then we'll let you get the book and read all the other adventures as well. But there's a story of my grandmother and my good friend's cowardly father. As a little boy, a lot of my father's friends who also served in the military would stop by to say hello. And guys that were Marines and the Army and the Air Force, they would teach me boxing. And they'd practice with me for about an hour, and I learned some pretty neat stuff. So when I had to fight as a kid, I was a pretty good fighter, and I pretty much won. I mean, sometimes I'd deal with a bully who later would want to confront me and have 2 or 3 of his friends with him. And I would beat all 4 of them up. They would go running away from me. But the reason for it is that first I'd ask God to help me do what needed to be done. But also I knew that if I allowed any of them to grab me and hold on to me, it was over for me. They could beat me to a pulp. So I fought like the Tasmanian devil. I would be after them like a windmill, and they'd just say, enough of this, let me out of here. Well, that's how that went. But my friend, we'll call him Johnny. He and I were really good friends growing up together, and we played a lot together. But sometimes he was so dumb, he would look at me and he would say, I think I can beat you up. I would say, do you want to try? And he said, yeah. Well, we'd have our fight, and every time I won. Well, as soon as he said I gave up, that was it for me. The fight was over. But his cowardly father, who during World War II was given a dishonorable discharge, he had a nervous breakdown when told he would be sent over to the Pacific to fight the Japanese. He was scared to death that he would die. And he refused to go and had a nervous breakdown. They gave him a dishonorable discharge. Well, this very brave man didn't like the fact that his son would always lose the fights, even though the truth is he was the one who always picked the fights. I was happy just playing happily together with him. So one day we were in Johnny's backyard playing, and his father came out on the back steps of the porch, and he called out to us to come over. When I got over to him, now at the time I believe I was 7 years old and Johnny was 6. So I came over to where he was, and as soon as I did, he grabbed both of my arms from behind and he held me. And he's a grown man. I couldn't get away from him. I tried as hard as I could to jerk loose, shake loose from his grip, but he had too good a grip and he had too many muscles that I didn't have. So he had a vice-like grip on both of my arms. Then he said to his son, "Okay, Johnny, do what I tell you. I want you to beat this bully up." Well, Johnny knew that it was wrong. And he started crying and he said, "No, Daddy, I don't want to do that. That's not right." His father said to him, "You'd better do it. If you don't, I'm going to give you the worst spanking you've ever had." And at that, Johnny started faking hitting me, just as lightly as he could. His father observed that and he called out to him and he said, "You better hit him hard. If you don't, you're going to get the worst spanking of your life." So Johnny started hitting me hard and I couldn't get away. And his father wouldn't let him stop until he was finished. But when he was finished, I wound up with a bloody nose, a bloody lip. I was hurting all over. My stomach felt like the ribs in the movie Rocky that Rocky practiced on. I felt sore on both of my ribs and my stomach. And I went running home crying. And home was about half a block away on the other side of the street. Well, my grandmother heard me coming down the street, and as I got to where I was getting ready to come up the steps to our front porch, she came running out the door, and she saw my condition. My shirt was ragged, my lip was bleeding, my nose was bleeding, and she said, "Joe, what happened to you?" And as I cried, I said, "Johnny's father held me while Johnny beat me up." Now this is what I love about my grandmother. So many women don't have the guts to do what she did, but she did what needed to be done. She said, "Do you know what you're going to do?" And I'm thinking, yeah, I'm going to go in and wash up and lay down. Right now I don't really feel all that great. My grandmother said to me, "You're going right back over there and you're going to beat Johnny up." And I said, "No, no." And she said, "Yes, yes, yes." And she went, we had this hedge around our front yard, and she went and broke a branch off of that, made a switch out of it, and started slapping me on my legs with that switch. It stung. She was angry. And like cattle, she herded me back over to Johnny's house. Now up north, the houses have a long driveway with a garage in the back. So the funny part was, by the time we got to his house, I was trying to outrun my grandmother and get it. I tried to run away, but when I did, she'd run after me, catch me, and whack me some more and herded me over to his house. Well, as I entered the back area, his father was still sitting on the porch steps and was patting him on the head. "I'm so proud of you, you beat that bully up." And my grandmother was just entering the front of that driveway. So the father looks over at me and he saw me out of the corner of his eye. He said, "Well, well, Johnny, look who's back for more." And at that he started to get up and walk toward me. Suddenly my grandmother appeared, switch in her hand. And she pointed that switch to him and she said, "You damn son of a bitch." She said, "I ought to have you arrested, if not kill you myself." She said, "For what you did to Joe." Then she said to me, "Okay, Joe, his father's standing here watching. You go on over and you beat Johnny up." Well, I felt so sorry for Johnny. It wasn't his fault. "Oh, I am tears. Oh, come on, Johnny, I'm going to beat you up." Well, we got into it and I won. And then my grandmother told this clown, she said, and another thing, he'd been using our yard as a shortcut to take the bus to go to the place where he worked. She said, "From now on, your shortcut days are over. You go the long way around. If I ever see you coming through my yard, I'll take my pistol out and blow your damn head off, and I'll swear you tried to attack me." Well, that was the end of his using our yard for a shortcut. In the meantime, what it did for me was it taught me how to have what the people in the boxing profession call heart. Because I was sincerely hurting all over. I was in pain. And yet I found out that even then, I could still win the fight. if I was determined enough to do it. So it was really quite a interesting situation in my life, and it taught me a very valuable lesson that's helped me through life when I've had to get into fights to defend myself. Now, there's one last thing that I want to share with you. That is, I grew up in a home where my grandparents really loved and cared for one another. Love was not a stranger to them or to me. Both of them always gave me so much loving guidance. But there is this story of the time when I was hiking in the hills, which I did very often. I started at the age of 6, maybe even 5, I started. And before we moved away, when I was 11, I would estimate that either alone or with my friends, I'd hiked through those hills behind our home at least 200 times, and that's being conservative. I would follow the paths made by hunters. And there were the Kentucky wildcats in those woods. There were bear in the woods. I would see the hunters come back from a hunting trip with the bear tied over a long branch that a hunter on each end was carrying, and they'd carve him up and divide the meat among their families. There was rattlesnakes and copperheads, and all the time God kept me safe. Only once did my friend Johnny and I run into a rattlesnake. We threw rocks at it and it chased us downhill. Fortunately, the hill was steep, and as we ran, even as a little kid with our little feet, we outran it, and it finally gave up. But it was twisting itself over and over, going down the same road we were going, trying to catch up with us. And so that was the closest we came to, a serious situation. In the meantime, my story is about the one time when I'd hiked so far back into the hills, and I would do that on occasion. I would say, well, let's see where this goes. And I'd go up one hill and down another. But I'd hiked so long, I hadn't watched the time, and it was getting dark on me. And I didn't get back out of the hills until it was dark. It was about 8 o'clock at night. That was something scary. When I'm coming back down and I finally saw where there was houses, they had their lights turned on. And it gave me an indication of which direction I needed to go in. But what happened was, where I had to go up into the hills, you had to first cross a 4-lane highway. Then you had to cross all these railroad tracks leading to the roundhouse. There was about 10 tracks that led in and out from the roundhouse for trains to come in for repair and then get sent back out again. So you had to cross those and then get up into the hills. Well, about a block and a half away from our home, there was an underpass that was built so that people could walk under those tracks without worrying about getting hit by a train. So here I got back, and it was lighted. So I get back, and I'm on the other side of that underpass. And as I made my way through, and I got to the opening that was on our side of the road, I got to look outside and see my grandmother, who was standing there. She was pacing up and down, and she was praying her heart out for me. She was asking God that I would return safe, that I wasn't harmed, that I wasn't lost, that I wasn't starving, that I would be brought back safely to her. And she was so concerned and so worried about me. And so I really felt convicted. I felt so upset that I'd caused her all this worry. So I'm thinking, in an effort to relieve all of her worry, I need to let her know that I'm here, that I'm okay. So I decided to pop out in her presence, and I said, Ruth, don't cry, don't worry, I'm here and I'm okay. Well, I didn't stay okay. I hadn't noticed that she had a switch in her hand. And all of a sudden she started whacking me with that switch, and she was admonishing and warning me about coming back from the hills after dark. And that was a well-learned lesson, because I never let that happen again. And in closing, I just want to say that I was so blessed being raised by my grandparents, Both of them were excellent examples of what a true Christian is. They weren't religious. They went to the Catholic Church, but they weren't filled with its religious garbage. And they taught me valuable lessons regarding having, not being, character. The values of truth, honesty, self-respect, and following God and the American way. I'm proud to be among America's patriots. Trump in 2020. Never will I vote for communists. And then lastly, I was taught to be a good Irish Kentuckian. I was taught never be a bully. Never pick a fight with anyone who isn't needing it. Sometimes by their words and attitude, they need someone to fight them, to teach them not to do that. But I was taught if some dummy picks a fight with you, don't walk away until you find out who won the fight. Now, as bullies are basically cowards, letting them know they would have to pay a very painful price to fight me saved me from having to fight many of them at all. They don't want to have to fight. They think you're somebody easy that they can just step all over. And when you let them know they made a serious mistake, it's amazing to watch their attitude change. Now, I would always offer them a choice of one of three options. I would tell them you can either fight, run away as fast as you can, or be wise and sincerely apologize to me. It was amazing how quickly most of them would apologize. Some, as they ran their mouth full of ignorant, foul-mouthed, moronic words, cuss words, using God's name in vain, when they finished, I would look at them and I would say, has anyone ever told you that you have a very bad case of moron mouth? They would say, moron mouth? I said, yes, don't you know that only morons talk like you do? You have to be an ignorant meathead to talk like you did. You can't even communicate to me intelligently. Now, do you plan on fighting me with your fist, or do you plan on boring me to death by showing me how stupid you are? And they would say, wait a minute, I'm sorry. So it's good to have the right attitude when you have to deal with bullies. And both of my grandparents, who actually were my parents, taught me to have that kind of attitude. You don't have to take bull off of anybody. Have the guts to be a man and stand up for what's right. And I'm very glad that as I'm approaching my 76th year, I can look at myself in the mirror and know that I've spent a life of doing just that. And I've never ever really tried to be anyone's bully. Unless, as I say, they proved to me they needed someone to teach them and not to talk to me that way. Well, that's all I have for today. I hope you find it enjoyable, and get your copy of Ruth and Sam, Golden Memories of My Grandparents by Joe Callihan. Bye-bye.